Jake "Thunder" Mitchell stood in front of his bathroom mirror, flexing his massive arms as he admired the collection of championship belts hanging on his bedroom wall. At 28 years old, he had never lost a fight in his professional mixed martial arts career. 37 wins, 0 losses, and a reputation that made opponents nervous before they even stepped into the ring. With him, the morning sun streamed through the windows of his luxury apartment in Manchester, illuminating the numerous trophies and awards that decorated every surface. Jake had worked hard for this success, training since he was 15 years old. But somewhere along the way, the victories had gone to his head. His phone buzzed with another interview request from a sports magazine. Jake barely glanced at it before tossing the device onto his unmade bed. He was tired of interviews, tired of people asking the same questions about his training routine and fighting philosophy. Everyone wanted to know the secret to his success, but Jake knew the truth was simpler than they imagined. He was just better than everyone else. Jake's trainer, Old Pete, had been trying to reach him for days about an upcoming fight, but Jake had been avoiding his calls. Pete was always going on about respect, discipline, and staying humble. All that old-school nonsense that Jake felt was holding him back from bigger opportunities. The truth was, Jake was bored. His last 3 opponents had been knockouts in the first round. The thrill of competition was fading because no one could match his skill level. He had started to believe his own publicity, thinking he was invincible not just in the ring, but everywhere. Jake decided to take a walk through London to clear his head. He threw on his signature leather jacket, the one with Undefeated embroidered on the back in gold letters. Wherever he went, people recognized him. Some asked for autographs. Others just stared in awe at the famous fighter walking among them as he strolled through the busy streets. Jake felt the familiar rush of being recognized and admired. A group of teenagers pointed at him excitedly, whispering among themselves about seeing the famous champion in person. 2 young women approached him for selfies, giggling as they posed beside his muscular frame. But the attention wasn't enough anymore. Jake craved something more, something that would prove once and for all that he was superior to ordinary people. He had money, fame, and an undefeated record, but he wanted to test his abilities outside the controlled environment of the ring. Jake's wandering eventually brought him to the area around Buckingham Palace. The crowds of tourists were thick, all eagerly taking photos of the iconic royal guards in their red uniforms and tall black hats. Jake watched with amusement as people tried unsuccessfully to make the guards react, taking countless selfies with the motionless figures. "Look at these guys," Jake muttered to himself, standing around like statues, pretending to be tough. Observe the guards more closely, noting their rigid posture and expressionless faces. To Jake, they looked like actors in costumes, playing dress-up for the entertainment of tourists. He had heard stories about their training, but he dismissed them as exaggerated legends designed to maintain the mystique of British tradition. One guard in particular caught Jake's attention. He was slightly older than the others, probably in his late 30s, with a weathered face that suggested real experience. Something about his presence seemed different from the other guards, more substantial somehow. But Jake attributed this to his imagination. The crowds were dense around this particular guard, with children pressing their faces against the iron railings and adults competing for the best photo angles. Jake pushed through the crowd, his imposing size making people step aside automatically, standing just a few feet from the guard. Jake studied him with the analytical eye of a fighter. He estimated the man's height, weight, and physical condition, mentally comparing them to his own superior attributes. The guard remained perfectly still, eyes focused straight ahead, giving no indication that he was aware of Jake's scrutiny. "I bet I could drop this guy in 10 seconds, Jake thought to himself, a smirk crossing his face. The idea began to grow in Jake's mind like a seed taking root. What if he could prove his superiority over these supposedly elite soldiers? If he could show the world that all their ceremony and tradition meant nothing against real fighting skill? Jake had always been impulsive, but his success had made him reckless. The combination of his undefeated record and growing arrogance was creating a dangerous mixture of overconfidence and boredom. He was looking for a challenge, for something that would remind him why he loved fighting in the first place, As he stood there watching the motionless guard, Jake began to formulate a plan that would satisfy his need for excitement, while proving his dominance over what he saw as outdated symbols of authority. He had no idea that his assumptions about the guards were about to be challenged in ways he never could have imagined. The afternoon sun was getting warmer, and the crowd around the palace gates was growing larger. Remained focused on the guard, studying every detail of his uniform and posture, planning his approach. In his mind, this would be easy, almost unfairly so. After all, what could a ceremonial soldier possibly do against an undefeated champion? The royal guard that Jake was observing was Sergeant William Hayes, a man with 22 years of military service behind him. Like Jake's assumptions, William was far from a ceremonial decoration. He had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, earned commendations for bravery under fire, and had trained in multiple forms of combat throughout his distinguished career. William was acutely aware of Jake's presence and scrutiny. His training had taught him to remain alert to everything happening around him while maintaining his ceremonial composure. He had noticed the large man in the leather jacket pushing through the crowd and studying him intently. But protocol demanded he remain motionless and focus straight ahead. What Jake didn't know was that royal guards underwent extensive physical and mental training that went far beyond what tourists saw. They were active military personnel, not actors in costumes. William had maintained his combat readiness throughout his years of ceremonial duty, continuing to train and study new fighting techniques even while serving at the palace. Jake's confidence continued to build as he watched William stand perfectly still. In Jake's experience, stillness meant weakness. In the ring, his opponents were always moving, always trying to find an angle or an opening. This guard's rigid posture looked vulnerable and easy to exploit. "This is going to be too easy, Jake," whispered to himself, cracking his knuckles as he prepared to make his move. The plan forming in Jake's mind was simple, but arrogant. He would approach the guard and provoke some kind of reaction, maybe a small push or an insulting comment. When the guard inevitably tried to respond, Jake would demonstrate his superior fighting skills in front of all these witnesses. The video would go viral, cementing his reputation as not just undefeated in the ring, but dominant over any kind of opponent. Jake began walking closer to William, his stride confident and purposeful. The crowd of tourists naturally parted around him, sensing something was about to happen but not sure what. Some people began pulling out their phones, instinctively knowing that the famous fighter's approach to the guard might produce something worth recording. "Hey there, toy soldier," Jake called out loudly enough for the surrounding crowd to hear. It must be nice having such an easy job, just standing around looking pretty for the cameras. William's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but every muscle in his body was now coiled and ready. His military training had taught him to assess threats quickly and accurately, and this civilian was clearly trying to provoke an incident. William had dealt with difficult tourists before, but something about this man's demeanor suggested a more serious challenge. Jake moved even closer, and now standing just inches from William's position. "What's wrong? Can't talk? Or are you just too scared to respond to someone who could actually fight back?" The crowd around them began to grow as people sensed the tension building between the famous fighter and the stoic guard. Camera phones were raised and excited whispers spread through the group of onlookers. This was unprecedented. No one had ever seen someone challenge a royal guard so directly and aggressively. "I know who you are," Jake continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're supposed to be some kind of elite soldier, right? All that fancy training and ceremonial nonsense. But I bet you've never faced anyone like me." William's training included extensive instruction on how to handle provocations while maintaining his post. He was not allowed to respond verbally or physically unless there was an immediate threat to himself or others. But Jake's aggressive posturing and increasingly hostile language were pushing the boundaries of what could be considered acceptable tourist behavior. Jake reached out and tapped William firmly on the chest, a clear violation of protocol and a deliberate provocation. "Come on, soldier boy, show me what all that military training is worth." That touch crossed a line that William could not ignore. In a voice that was calm but carried unmistakable authority, William spoke for the first time. "Sir, please step back and maintain your distance." Jake laughed loudly, pleased that he had finally gotten a reaction. "Oh, he can talk. And what happens if I don't step back? Are you going to make me?" The challenge was now explicit and public. Jake was essentially daring William to abandon his post and engage in a confrontation. The crowd had grown larger, with people pushing forward to get a better view of this unprecedented scene unfolding at one of London's most famous landmarks. William understood that he was being tested, not just by this arrogant civilian, but by the dozens of witnesses recording every moment. His response would need to be measured, professional, and effective. He also recognized that Jake's confidence came from a fundamental misunderstanding of what royal guards actually were. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to step back," William said, his voice remaining steady but gaining an edge that suggested serious consequences if the warning was ignored. Jake flexed his shoulders and rolled his neck, loosening up, as if preparing for a workout. "And I'm telling you that I don't take orders from costumed soldiers. If you want me to move, you're going to have to make me move." The gauntlet had been thrown down in front of hundreds of witnesses. Jake was certain he had backed the guard into a corner from which there was no graceful escape. In his mind, William had two choices: back down and look weak, or try to force the issue and get humiliated by a professional fighter. What Jake failed to understand was that William Hayes had faced far more dangerous situations than an arrogant celebrity looking for attention. The Taliban fighters he had encountered in Afghanistan would have laughed at Jake's posturing and bravado. This was not William's first test of courage, and it certainly wouldn't be his last. The crowd held its collective breath, sensing that something significant was about to happen between these two very different men. The tension reached its breaking point as Jake took another step closer to William, now standing well within the guard's personal space. The famous fighter's arrogance was on full display as he assumed his aggressive stance, confident that years of ring victories had prepared him for any confrontation. "Last chance, tin soldier," Jake taunted, his voice loud enough for the growing crowd to hear every word. "Move aside, or I'll move you aside." William made a subtle shift in his posture that most of the crowd missed, but Jake's fighter instincts picked up on the change. For just a moment, Jake felt a flicker of uncertainty. There was something different about the way the guard positioned himself, like something that suggested real training rather than ceremonial posturing. But Jake's ego quickly suppressed any doubts. He had faced professional fighters, athletes who had trained their entire lives for combat. What could a palace guard possibly do that Jake hadn't seen before? "You know what your problem is?" Jake continued his verbal assault. "You think that uniform makes you tough? But underneath all that fancy dress-up, you're just another weekend warrior who's never faced real opposition." William's military training had taught him to read people quickly and accurately. He could see that Jake was not just arrogant but genuinely believed his own publicity. The fighter had confused his success in a controlled sport with real-world capability, a dangerous mistake that William had seen cost lives in combat situations. Jake decided it was time to end this charade. He reached out to push William aside, intending to demonstrate his physical superiority with a simple display of strength. In Jake's mind, the guard would either stumble backward in humiliation or try to resist and get. Embarrassed by Jake's superior technique, what happened next defied all of Jake's expectations. As Jake's hand moved toward William's chest, the guard's training took over, with a movement so quick and precise that most observers missed it entirely. William intercepted Jake's arm, redirected the energy of his push, and used Jake's own momentum against him. Jake found himself off balance and stumbling, his confident push having been effortlessly neutralized. The crowd gasped as the undefeated champion struggled to regain his footing, clearly surprised by what had just occurred. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, his face flushing with embarrassment and anger. William resumed his ceremonial position as if nothing had happened, his expression remaining neutral and professional, but his message was clear. Jake's assumption about the guards' capabilities had been completely wrong. Jake's pride was now fully engaged. Being outmaneuvered by someone he considered inferior was unacceptable. His reputation was on the line in front of all these witnesses, and social media would soon broadcast his humiliation to the world unless he restored his dominance immediately. "You got lucky," Jake snarled, preparing for a more serious attack. "Let's see how you handle a real fighter." This time Jake approached with genuine fighting technique, throwing a quick jab designed to test Williams' defenses while setting up a more powerful combination. Jake was confident that his professional training would overwhelm whatever basic combat skills the guard might possess. Williams' response was swift and devastating. The guard's counter movement was a masterpiece of economy and precision. He didn't block Jake's punch so much as redirected, using minimal energy to send Jake's attack harmlessly past its target. Simultaneously, Williams' own response found its mark with surgical accuracy. Jake felt a sharp pain in his wrist as Williams' counter technique temporarily numbed his punching arm. The fighter staggered backward, shaking his hand and trying to restore feeling to his fingers. The crowd erupted in excited chatter as it became clear that the professional fighter was not dominating this encounter as everyone had expected. "This isn't possible," Jake thought to himself, a genuine shock replacing his earlier confidence. William maintained his position, still appearing calm and composed, despite having just neutralized two separate attacks from a professional fighter. His breathing remained steady, and his stance suggested he was prepared for whatever Jake might try next. For the first time in his adult life, Jake Mitchell was facing an opponent who was not intimidated by his reputation or affected by his psychological warfare. William Hayes had faced real danger in real combat situations, where the stakes were life and death rather than prize money and titles. Jake was beginning to realize that he had seriously underestimated his opponent, but his pride would not allow him to back down in front of so many witnesses. The crowd had grown to several hundred people, tourists and locals alike recording every moment of this unprecedented confrontation. The famous undefeated champion was about to learn that there were different kinds of strength, different types of training, and different levels of real-world experience that no amount of ring victories could prepare him for. Jake flexed his shoulders again, trying to shake off the effects of Williams' precise counterattacks. His confidence was shaken but not broken, and his anger was beginning to override his better judgment. He was about to escalate this confrontation to a level that would change both men's lives forever. Jake's frustration was reaching dangerous levels as he circled around William, looking for an opening that would allow him to land a decisive blow. The crowd had grown massive, with people standing on benches and holding their phones high to capture what was becoming a legendary confrontation. "You think you're clever with your little tricks," Jake said, his voice now strained with anger and embarrassment. "But I'm a professional fighter. I've trained for this my entire life." William remained motionless in his ceremonial position, but his eyes tracked Jake's movement with the precision of someone who had spent years identifying threats in hostile environments. Every muscle in his body was relaxed yet ready, a state of preparedness that took years of real combat experience to develop. Jake launched his most serious attack yet, a combination of strikes that had knocked out 3 of his last opponents in professional matches. He threw a feint with his left hand, followed immediately by a powerful right cross aimed at Williams' jaw, then prepared to follow up with a devastating uppercut. What happened next would be replayed millions of times on social media and analyzed by martial arts experts around the world. William moved with a fluidity that seemed almost supernatural to the untrained observers. He didn't just block or dodge Jake's attacks, he seemed to anticipate them before they began. The guard's response was a seamless blend of defensive and offensive techniques that neutralized Jake's combination while simultaneously creating an opportunity for his own counter-dash attack. Jake felt his powerful right cross get redirected with such precision that he spun slightly off balance. Before he could recover, Williams' response connected with a pressure point on Jake's shoulder that sent numbing pain down his entire right arm. The undefeated champion stumbled backward, his arm temporarily useless. The crowd erupted in cheers and gasps as they witnessed something unprecedented. A professional fighter being systematically outclassed by a royal guard who hadn't even left his post. Camera phones captured every moment as Jake struggled to understand how his most effective techniques were being neutralized so easily. "This is impossible," Jake gasped, trying to shake feeling back into his arm. "You're just a guard. I'm a champion." William finally spoke again, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned respect through actions rather than publicity. Son, there's a difference between fighting for sport and fighting for survival. You've mastered one, but you know nothing about the other. The words hit Jake harder than any physical blow could have. For the first time, he was forced to confront the possibility that his undefeated record might not mean what he thought it meant. Ring fighting, with its rules and referees and controlled conditions, was apparently very different from the kind of combat this guard had experienced. Jake's anger flared again, but now it was mixed with desperation. His reputation was crumbling in front of hundreds of witnesses, and he could already imagine the headlines: "Undefeated champion humiliated by palace guard." His career, his identity, everything he had built was collapsing in real time. "I don't care what kind of soldier you think you are," Jake snarled, preparing for one final all-out assault. "I'm ending this right now." Jake abandoned all technique and strategy, relying purely on his superior size and strength for a rushing attack designed to overwhelm William through brute force. It was the kind of desperate move that professional fighters were trained never to attempt. But Jake's ego could no longer tolerate being outmatched. William's response was swift and decisive as Jake charged forward. William used a technique he had learned during urban combat training in Afghanistan. As he stepped slightly to one side, redirected Jake's momentum, and applied a control hold that brought the much larger man to the ground with minimal effort. Jake found himself face down on the pavement, his arm twisted behind his back, in a position that would cause serious injury if he struggled. William's knee was positioned precisely on Jake's back, applying just enough pressure to keep him immobilized without causing permanent damage. The crowd fell silent as they witnessed the complete and total defeat of the famous undefeated champion. Jake Mitchell, who had never lost a professional fight, was now lying helplessly on the ground, subdued by a royal guard who had barely moved from his ceremonial position. "Are you ready to calm down and behave like a civilized person?" William asked quietly, his voice carrying no anger or triumph, just professional competence. Jake's face was pressed against the cold pavement, his body held in a controlled position that he had never experienced before. For the first time in years, he felt truly vulnerable and completely outmatched. The physical defeat was bad enough, but the psychological impact was devastating. "Yes," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm done." William immediately released the hold and helped Jake to his feet, demonstrating the same professionalism he had shown throughout the entire encounter. There was no gloating, no celebration of victory, just a job completed with appropriate force. In control, Jake stood on shaky legs, his entire worldview having been shattered in the span of a few minutes. The man he had dismissed as a toy soldier had just demonstrated fighting skills that were far superior to anything Jake had encountered in professional competition. The crowd began to applaud, not in mockery of Jake's defeat, but in appreciation of William's remarkable display of skill and restraint. They had witnessed something extraordinary, a masterclass in real combat. Effectiveness delivered by someone who truly understood the difference between fighting and warfare. Jake stood in stunned silence, his chest heaving as he tried to process what had just happened to him. The crowd around them was buzzing with excitement and disbelief, but their voices seemed distant and muffled to Jake's ears. His entire sense of identity was crumbling as he faced the reality that everything he thought he knew about fighting had just been proven inadequate. William resumed his ceremonial position, the same calm professionalism he had maintained throughout the entire encounter. To the casual observer, it was as if nothing had happened at all. But Jake could see something in the guard's eyes now, not mockery or superiority, but something that looked almost like sympathy. "I don't understand," Jake said quietly, his voice hoarse with confusion and humiliation. I've trained my whole life. I've never lost a fight. How did you?" William glanced at Jake briefly, breaking his ceremonial composure for just a moment. "Son, you've trained to be excellent at a sport. It's admirable, and you should be proud of what you've accomplished. But sport fighting and real combat are two completely different things." The words stung because they carried the weight of obvious truth. Jake had dominated in the ring because he understood the rules the techniques, and the strategies that worked within that specific environment.
Oh.
But William had just demonstrated that there were entire dimensions of combat that Jake had never even considered. Several police officers were now approaching, having been called by palace security to deal with the disturbance. Jake realized that he could face serious charges for assaulting a royal guard, regardless of how the confrontation had ended. His legal troubles could be just as devastating to his career as his public humiliation. But William surprised him again. "Officers," William said as the police arrived. This gentleman became overly excited about meeting a royal guard. He meant no harm, just got a bit carried away with his enthusiasm. "I believe he's learned to maintain appropriate boundaries now." Stared at William in shock. The guard was protecting him from prosecution, despite having every right to press charges for assault. This act of mercy was perhaps more humbling than the physical defeat had been. "Is that correct, sir?" One of the police officers asked Jake directly. "You were just being an enthusiastic tourist." Jake nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. "Yes, officer. I got carried away. It won't happen again." The police officers looked skeptical but accepted William's account of the incident. They warned Jake about appropriate behavior around royal properties and dispersed the crowd before moving on to other duties. Jake was left standing alone with William, the massive crowd having been reduced to just a few lingering tourists taking distant photos. "Why?" Jake asked simply. "Why didn't you let them arrest me? I attacked you. I deserved whatever consequences came from that." William was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Because I've seen what real enemies look like, and you're not one of them. You're just a young man who got too big for his britches and needed to be reminded that there's always someone better." The kindness in William's response was almost harder to bear than the physical defeat. Jake had expected anger, mockery, or at least satisfaction from the guard who had just ended his undefeated streak. Instead, he was receiving wisdom and compassion from someone he had tried to humiliate. "I've ruined everything," Jake said, more to himself than to William. "My reputation, my career, my identity. Everyone saw what happened. It'll be all over the internet in minutes." "Your reputation was built on wins and losses," William replied. "But your character is built on how you handle defeat. This could be the end of your story, or it could be the beginning of a better chapter." Jake looked around at the few remaining tourists, some still recording him with their phones. He could already imagine the headlines, the social media posts, the commentary from sports analysts who would dissect his humiliation frame by frame. His undefeated record was gone, but more importantly, his illusion of invincibility had been shattered completely. "I don't know how to be anything other than undefeated," Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's who I am. That's all I am." "No," William said firmly. "That's who you thought you had to be. But maybe it's time to discover who you actually are underneath all that armor you've been wearing." Jake felt tears threatening to form in his eyes, but he fought them back. He had spent so many years building walls around himself, convincing himself that he was superior to everyone else, that he had forgotten what it felt like to be vulnerable and human. "What do I do now?" Jake asked, looking directly at William for the first time, with genuine respect rather than arrogance. "Yes." "You go home," William replied. "You think about what happened here today, and tomorrow you decide whether you want to be the same person who walked up to me an hour ago, or if you want to become someone better." Jake nodded slowly, understanding that William was offering him something more valuable than victory or defeat. He was offering him the chance to grow as a person. The physical confrontation was over, but the real challenge was just beginning. As Jake turned to walk away, William called out to him one final time. "Mr. Mitchell, your fighting skills are impressive within their context. Don't let today destroy your confidence entirely. Just let it teach you some humility." Jake paused, his back still turned to William.
"Thank you,"
he said quietly, "for the lesson and for not destroying me completely when you could have." The walk home would be the longest of Jake's life, filled with reflection, regret, and the dawning realization that true strength had very little to do with never losing a fight. 6 months after his humbling encounter with Sergeant William Hayes, Jake Mitchell's life had transformed in ways he never could have imagined. The video of his defeat had indeed gone viral, generating millions of views and countless memes. Instead of destroying his career as he had feared, it had opened doors to opportunities he had never considered. Jake was now sitting in a small community center in East London, teaching self-defense classes to at-risk youth. The leather jacket with Undefeated embroidered on the back had been replaced with a simple T-shirt bearing the logo of the non-profit organization he had founded, Second Chances Combat Academy. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. In the weeks following his encounter with William, Jake had fallen into a deep depression. His sponsors had dropped him, his upcoming fights were canceled. The media had branded him as an arrogant celebrity who had gotten his comeuppance. For a while it seemed like his worst fears about losing were coming true, but then something unexpected happened. Among all the negative comments and mockery online, Jake began to notice a different type of message. People were sharing their own stories of humbling experiences that had changed their lives for the better. Veterans, teachers, parents, and young people were talking about how Jake's public lesson in humility had inspired them to examine their own arrogance and pride. Old Pete, Jake's former trainer, had been the first to reach out with a proposal. "You've got a choice, son," Pete had said during a difficult conversation. "You can let this define you as a failure, or you can use it as the foundation for something meaningful." That conversation had led Jake to seek out William Hayes. Finding the Royal Guard off duty had taken some effort. But Jake had been determined to have a real conversation with the man who had changed his life so dramatically. Their meeting at a quiet pub in London had been awkward at first. Jake had expected to find someone who would gloat about his victory or lecture him about his mistakes. Instead, he found a humble man who was genuinely interested in helping. Jake understood the lessons that could be learned from their encounter. "The biggest difference between us that day," William had explained, "wasn't our fighting ability. It was our understanding of what real strength looks like. You thought strength was about never losing? I learned that real strength comes from serving something bigger than yourself." That conversation had planted the seed for Jake's transformation. He began volunteering at veteran support organizations. Learning about the kind of real-world challenges that William and his fellow soldiers had faced, he discovered that many of his fighting skills could be adapted to help people in genuinely meaningful ways. The community center where Jake now worked was located in one of London's most challenging neighborhoods. The young people who attended? His classes came from backgrounds filled with violence, poverty, and limited opportunities. Many of them reminded Jake of his younger self, angry, arrogant, and convinced that physical dominance was the answer to their problems. Listen up. Jake called to the group of teenagers who were practicing basic defensive techniques. Anyone can throw a punch when they're angry. The real challenge is knowing when not to throw one. 16-year-old Marcus looked up from his practice with a skeptical expression. "That's easy for you to say, Mr. Jake. You were famous for winning fights. We saw the videos." Jake smiled at the reference to his old career. "Marcus, I want you to see a different video, one that changed everything for me." He pulled out his phone and showed the group the footage of his encounter with William Hayes. Jake had learned to watch it without the crushing embarrassment he had felt initially. Now he saw it as documentation of the most important lesson he had ever received. "This man taught me that being undefeated in the ring doesn't mean anything if you're defeated as a person," Jake explained to the attentive group. "Real victory comes from using your strength to help others, not to prove how tough you are." The impact on the young people was visible. Many of them had joined the program expecting to learn how to fight better. Instead, they were learning about discipline, respect, and channeling their energy into positive directions. Jake's phone buzzed with a text message from William Hayes. "Saw the newspaper article about your program. Proud of the man you've become, WH." The newspaper article had featured Jake's transformation from arrogant champion to community leader. The journalist had interviewed several of the young people in his program, who spoke glowingly about how Jake's honesty about his own failures had inspired them to make better choices in their own lives. Jake's fighting career had officially ended, but he had never felt more fulfilled or purposeful. His undefeated record was gone, but it had been replaced by something far more valuable, the knowledge that he was making a real difference in people's lives. Later that evening, Jake received a phone call that would complete his transformation. It was from the British Army's Community Outreach Program, inviting him to collaborate on a new initiative, bringing together veterans and former athletes to mentor young people. "We've been following your work," the caller explained. "Sergeant Hayes recommended you personally, said you understand the difference between winning and succeeding." Jake accepted the invitation immediately, understanding that his encounter with William had created opportunities for service that extended far beyond anything he could have achieved through fighting. As he walked home that night through the same London streets where he had once strutted with arrogant confidence, Jake reflected on how completely his life had changed. The defeat that had seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of his real purpose. He thought about the young people in his program, the veterans he worked with, and the community he now served. His old life had been about proving he was better than everyone else. His new life was about helping others become better versions of themselves. The undefeated champion had learned that true victory wasn't about never losing, it was about what you did after you lost that defined who you really were. And in that sense, Jake Mitchell had finally become truly undefeated.